So good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be talking to you about the legal institutional roots of the rise of the Islamic State. The Islamic State, of course, is a development that made the media, hit the media news in 2014 with the march of militants across Al-Anbar province towards the latter half of the year. And until then, it wasn't on anyone's radar. Social scientists certainly didn't talk about it. Journalists didn't talk about it. Students didn't talk about it, although it was an extant entity since 2006. And it was really only a small group of Washington think tank-based scholars at AEI and elsewhere that were investigating the roots of ISIS and its links to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, of course, things have changed. The media has shifted focus. We've all seen the graphic images. We've all seen the destruction and death laid by ISIS, both in Iraq and Syria. Amnesty International has recently reported that ISIS has been launching a campaign of systemic targeting of ethnic minorities in the northern regions of Iraq on a truly historic scale. They've called it ethnic cleansing on a historic scale. Now, despite the fact that there is all this media attention and there are these policy wonks here and there devoting so much of their time and resources to ISIS, social scientists, broadly speaking, have not addressed the topic. And I think there are many reasons for this. On the one hand, we may be afraid to study a very recent development. We may be afraid to study a very politically contentious development. But I also think that as social scientists, with a wealth of background knowledge on the history of Iraq, as well as established social science theories, proving or attempting to prove otherwise the roots of escalating violence in post-transition regime change environments, it behooves us to study ISIS. And if the think tanks are doing it, then there's no reason why we shouldn't do it. The key questions I'm going to be addressing today is what can existing social science theories tell us about the rise of ISIS? And in turn, what can the rise of ISIS tell us, prove or disprove about existing social science theories? Must they be tweaked in order to account for this so-called Frankenstein case? Now, what I won't be talking about is ISIS in Syria. As I will point out later, that's an entirely different beast that's linked to the Assad government. And although it is correlated with the rise of ISIS in Iraq, they are entirely separate entities, both in their regional structure and in their political military command. Now, what do we know about ISIS? What do we know? What are the main facts on the ground which establish a basis from which we can extrapolate different social science theories? Well, we know that between 2003 and 2006, from the establishment of the Coalition Provisional Authority by the US and by the UK in 2003, until the formation of the nascent Islamic State of Iraq in 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq massively proliferated. So between 2003, it was known as Tawhid wal Jihad, and after 2004, it became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. All of a sudden in 2006, we had a transition from a foreign-directed insurgency group into a broad range of 6 Sunni Anbar tribes across Baghdad, Anbar, Diyala, Kirkuk, Salah al-Din, and Nineveh. Ex-Ba'athist militiamen were signing up, ex-government agents. All of a sudden, ISI was an entity in 2006. We also know that between 2007 and 2012, we had a rapid growth of ISI. And we know that ISI was driven out of Al-Anbar as a result of the US-led surge campaign between 2007 and 2008. We know that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi became the head of ISI in 2010, and of course, he remains the head of ISIS. And we also know that after the Americans departed in 2011, leaving the Iraqi security forces fully in charge of their national security, ISI militants simply came back. And in July 2012, we had a call by al-Baghdadi to retake and reclaim Al-Anbar province, which had recently been liberated by the Americans and held only just 6 months before. So therefore, between January 2007 and July 2012, ISI must have gained some degree of popular legitimacy and geopolitical prominence. Perhaps al-Baghdadi said it best: the majority of the Sunnis in Iraq support al-Qaeda and are waiting for its return. Here we have two maps. Now, this map right here is al-Qaeda in Iraq propaganda, developed in 2006, towards the end of the year, in October. And this map was actually part of a propaganda video that was announced declaring the establishment of the Islamic State of Iraq. As you can see, this territory largely comprises of Diyala province, Nineveh in the north, Al-Anbar, and a bit of western Baghdad, including Baghdad in the center. These regions, of course, were not controlled by ISI, but there were 6 Sunni tribes, as I mentioned, spread out all across all of these provinces. Over here on the right, we have ISIS in January 2016. This is the most recent map developed by the Institute for the Study of War in Washington. They have very, very effective maps. And as you can see, focusing on the territory of Iraq versus Syria, the territory now occupied by ISIS is largely similar to the propaganda map designed in 2006. And so in a sense, al-Qaeda has actually succeeded in their mission of creating a Sunni-based caliphate in the western region of Iraq. Here we have another map. This is the Islamic State of Iraq before and after the US-led search campaign. And this map was presented by General David Petraeus to the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2008 as a testimony to the successes of the renewed insurgency efforts there on the ground. As you can see, al-Qaeda in Iraq, this was sort of its stronghold at the height of its power in December 2006. A stronghold here in Al-Anbar province near Fallujah, Karbala, Ramadi, of course, which now, as we know, is an ISIS stronghold. And they had moved up to the north near Kirkuk, Mosul, which again is an ISIS stronghold. Here we have March 2008. This was after the Iraqi surge. And as we can see, the surge was very effective. What it had effectively done was displaced al-Qaeda in Iraq's stronghold in western Al-Anbar province. But nevertheless, there were sleeper cells that remained in the north and eastern sections of the country, and those sleeper cells were those that awoke after the US left in 2011. Now, we can ask some specific questions. First of all, how and why did sectarian conflict emerge in the post-Hussein environment? And how did this conflict lead to sectarian divisions? And how did it lead to the formation of extremist groups? There are various Sunni and Shia extremist groups, but of course, most prominently, al-Qaeda in Iraq /ISI. Later, between 2007 and 2012, we can ask, how did ISI establish itself as a quasi-legitimate entity with the trappings of a legitimate state? And how did it do so despite the temporary successes of the US counterinsurgency, which I just showed? There are a few social science explanatory theories, and these are the ones I'm going to focus on today, although my research covers a vast range of additional theories. Broadly speaking, there could be said to be political, legal, institutional, economic, and environmental preconditions or factors that lead to the rise of sectarianism and lead to the rise of non-state actors as powerful institutions within sectarian environments. These factors can be divided into internal and external factors. Internal factors are those which are agent-driven, so they're driven by particular political actors, driven by events on the ground constantly shifting. Now these can be either political or these can be either legal, institutional. Of course, we also have external factors. These are more structural, these are underlining factors, these are historical factors, perhaps more difficult to point to a particular event. And these, of course, can be either economic or environmental. These largely create what I'll later refer to as path dependencies in civil war. I'll first begin with some brief political explanations for violence. And this will not be the focus of my talk, simply because a lot of these political theories are well established in the field. But very briefly, Gledhill provides a very good summary of 3 distinct patterns of conflict manifestation and how political environments and struggle over newly created institutions leads to violence on the street. he maps out three different paths in which violence usually takes hold. Number one, between armed factions attempting to mold institutions, i.e. the public, as a result of a failed state apparatus. Number two, we have infighting between political elites, which vie for control over the newly established institutions, and this, of course, translates into violence on the ground. And number three, we have infighting between various security service structures within the new state, which vie for legitimacy within the newly created apparatuses. Gleditsch and Ruggeri also augment these established pathways by suggesting a strong correlation between unconventional leadership and weak state capacity, as well as opportunities to challenge the state by insurgents. In other words, Al-Qaeda in Iraq spotted the al-Maliki government as a nascent phenomenon, something that was outside of the norm, correlated that with a weak state and saw their opportunity to attack. Now, what actually happened on the ground? Elements of these political theories are echoed in the events on the ground. The Coalition Provisional Authority did dissolve Hussein's armed forces and disbanded the Ba'ath Party, leaving thousands of civilians on the street overnight. In a sense, we did actually have state failure, although I wouldn't call it full state failure. We also had various Sunni and Shiite extremist groups, the Sadrists, the Mahdi Army, Ansar al-Sunnah, Mujahideen Army, later the Mujahideen Council. And these took arms to essentially defend ethnic interests and protect traditional tribal boundaries in the anarchy that ensued. Here we have a very interesting graph from the Special Inspector General for Iraqi Reconstruction. And it shows the general level of troops that were trained and assigned by coalition forces between 2005 and 2009. And as we see that in 2005, and in fact even in 2007, at the height of the US counterinsurgency, the level of ISF troops that were trained by the Americans was between 200 and 400,000. Whereas before the de-Baathification policies of Paul Bremer and the CPA, we had almost 400,000 troops who were members of the Hussein army. Now, the fact that these numbers were only mitigated, and the pre-Hussein era, the Hussein era numbers only reached the same level under the occupation in 2007, just goes to show you how many people were disenfranchised by the de-Baathification policies, how many people were suddenly left on the ground without a job, armed people with connections to the military apparatus. Political elites, of course, did struggle for legitimacy within the new apparatus. The governing council body was established by the CPA to vet essentially the transitional authoritative law, which was the transitional constitution of 2003. This transplanted into street-level violence. The elite, of course, was not immune from violence. One of my favorite anecdotes, the National Assembly was largely appointed by Paul Bremer to, well, from different sects and different factions to help establish the permanent constitution of 2005. But right from one of the very first days of the National Assembly joining and deciding over the constitution, you had physical violence. So Sunni members were assassinated. And there was a strong speculation that they were assassinated by the other leaders, by Sunni, by Shia and Kurdish leaders. We also saw factions taking root within the state. So Sadrists infiltrated the ministries of transportation and health. What we saw was all sorts of speculation, which later turned out to be true as a result of American intelligence. Ambulances were used to transport arms between various parts of Baghdad. Hospitals in Baghdad were used as Sunni killing grounds by Shiite doctors and militias. We also saw a coordinated campaign of sectarian slaughter orchestrated by the Shia-dominant National Police. And this, of course, operated ostensibly under the watchful eye of the new Iraqi Interior Ministry. What was the strategy of Al-Qaeda in Iraq during this time? Well, it does echo the theory of Gleditsch and Ruggeri. They attempted to exploit existing sectarian divisions and launch a civil war by targeting Shiite religious shrines and populations in a long-term bid to plunge the fledgling state into anarchy. So their tactic truly was anarchy. Now, legal institutional theories. what can law and what can institutional environments tell us about the conditions that led to sectarianism on the ground? This is the novel part of my research. This is where I'm attempting to craft a new theory, a comparative approach between the 1989 Taif Accord in Lebanon and the semi and permanent constitutions in Iraq. These, of course, are most different cases in a sense. The Taif Accord was successful. It created, nominally successful on the surface, it created 20 years of peace. There continues to be relative peace and stability in Lebanon. Whereas the US imposed constitution of 2003 and 2005 was not so successful. Nevertheless, as we know in social sciences, often comparing two most different and disparate cases can net some interesting analytical insights. And now I turn to this book, Spoils of Truce, Corruption, State Building, Post-War Lebanon, by Reinoud Landers. He explains effectively what happened beneath the surface in Lebanon. On the surface, it was a success, but within the new apparatus, we had all sorts of division, all sorts of intrastate institutional cleavages that did result from the new constitution of 1989. This is what Leanders calls the politics of muhassasa, sort of a politics of allotment. The Taif Accord and the 1990 Constitution amendments had a logic of partitioning the spoils of public office, privileges, and resources, and this was, of course, intended to foster artificially equilibrium between all of the different sects and factions on the ground. But by de facto giving unique privileges to some sects over others, it led to the political fractioning of the nascent state identity and the fracturing of power along sectarian affiliations. Sectarian struggle, of course, didn't manifest itself in violence on the street, but it did manifest itself in gridlock between various political offices, chiefly between the president, the prime minister, and the council of ministers. Are there lessons from the Taif Accord for the Iraqi constitutions? I think so. There is a shared independent variable, to use the social science lingo, and that is the fact that both constitutions were externally imposed and both were consolidated agreements, either on behalf of the Syrians or on behalf of the CPA. Foreign powers came in and said, enough is enough, we need to institute peace, and this is how we're going to carve up the spoils of war, so to speak. The TAO's provisions in 2003 were written in English with very little regard for an effective Arabic translation by American officials very far away in Washington offices and by Brits in London offices. The permanent constitution in 2005 was not much better. It was nominally drafted by the National Assembly, but this, of course, was a body of officials personally appointed by Paul Bremer, who was the legal, political, and executive authority of the CPA. The American officials provide a very strict timeline, forcing the National Assembly to cobble together a draft in under 2 months. The draft itself, presented for voting in October 2005, was not the final document released by the CPA. Now, there was also a shared intermediary variable, and this is the institutionalization of divisions, the split of control of politics, laws and resources amongst federal states created within the new national framework. Jawad from the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics talks about how the governing council was the very first time in the history of Iraq that appointments were actually made on sectarian ethnic bases. So until then, sectarian divisions were largely loose cultural affiliations, various wars between various tribes. But in 2003, for the first time in history, sects, and in fact the word sect, was institutionalized in Iraqi vocabulary. Article 52 of the TAL notes the intention of the federal system and the good intention of the American federal system, American imposed federal system, to prevent the concentration of power in the federal government that allowed the continuation of decades of tyranny, i.e. the Hussein government. So the logic of drafting the TAL in 2003 and the permanent constitution followed the logic of the drafting of the American Constitution, in a sense. Article 53 created simple provisions for the establishment of new provinces. In effect, any group of no more than 3 governorates had the right to form regions and self-declare provinces. The same article, of course, granted the Kurdish regional government sweeping powers over contested territories in Kirkuk, Diyala, and Nineveh, with no major history of ethnic Kurdish settlements. This is the comparison I mentioned before. The new constitution was like America 200 years ago, right, a constitution and then a civil war. The 2005 permanent constitution was not much better than the Tao. What it did was, again, broadly divided the spoils of war between various provinces and various sects. Article 115 gave regional law priority over national law. And Article 121 gave provincial legislatures the right to amend the application of the national law within their own regions, effectively nullifying the national law if the provincial legislature believed that to be the right policy. Following the example of the oil-rich KRG, of course, geographic territories with extensive natural resources all of a sudden began claiming federal status, Basra, Misan, Tikar provinces, soon after the ratification of the constitution. Here we have a map of ethnic divisions in Iraq from the year 2000. And as you can see, in the north, we outlined in the purple and blue, this is the Kurdish population, which comprised approximately 20% of the population. The Sunni Arabs are located in the yellow regions, mostly in Al-Anbar province, and they comprise approximately 20% of the population. And the Shias are approximately 55% of the population. They can be identified near Basra province, eastern Baghdad, and throughout the entire southeast of the country. Here we have another wonderful map produced by ExxonMobil in 2010, identifying the key oil and natural gas resources in the country in 2010. Now, if you look at this map, the majority of oil and gas is located in the southeast provinces, which, if we remember from the previous map, were the Shiite stronghold, as well as in the northern provinces, which were dominated by the KRG. Here in the west, where the Sunnis had traditionally lived, we have very, very little oil and natural gas. We have some near Ramadi and near the west of Baghdad, which I'll get to in a minute. Now, the constitutional arrangement also had very, very loose language and unclear deadlines. The Taif Accord had given broad and undefined powers to the Syrian military occupant and had largely replicated this military advantage within the nascent Lebanese state, giving the impression of a favored Shiite class, that class within Lebanon which was allied to the foreign occupiers on the ground, the Syrians. In the Iraqi case, we had something very similar. Ambiguities in the legal language provided Shia factions with unique privileges. Article 7 made illicit any and all symbols and affiliations with the Ba'ath regime. This, of course, was part of the CPA's de-Baathification policies. But what this did, de facto, was prevent many Sunni sheikhs and local tribal leaders from running and getting involved in the political process. The same article also gave broad and undefined powers to the state to combat terrorism in all of its forms, equivalent to a sort of executive branch in the US Constitution. But this unfortunately allowed Prime Minister al-Maliki's office of the Commander-in-Chief to emerge as an extra-constitutional policy apparatus that, during the ISF surge on the ground, often issued sectarian orders directly to Iraqi units on the field. The lawmaking process as well was relatively unequal and further fueled these divisions on the ground. Shiite factions profited not only from the constitutional arrangement, but from the process itself. Members of the drafting committee, the National Assembly, were appointed according to sectarian quotas. And this seemed like a great idea at the time, except for the fact that these quotas were largely arbitrary, and they didn't coincide with the percentages of ethnic populations identified previously. While 28 Shiite representatives were selected by the CPA, only one Sunni member was initially appointed to sit on the committee alongside a single communist. This, of course, can lead to problems if 20% of the population is Sunni Arab. Key Sunni leaders, of course, opposed the constitution in the October 2005 vote, while the Sunni majority provinces of Salahuddin and Al-Anbar rejected the document outright. These became the heart of al-Qaeda in Iraq and later ISIS. Altogether, a popular image of American Shiite collusion played into al-Qaeda in Iraq's recruiting propaganda in the early years of the post-transition regime. And so my hypothesis for the period between 2006 and between 2003 and 2006 is that the legally institutionalized confessional cleavages led to the co-option of the state security apparatus into the intrastate sectarian competition, led to the rise of extremist groups offering sources of protection to divided populations, and to the onset of mass armed sectarian struggle in 2006. Here we have two more maps. Here is a map provided by Stratfor in 2014, comparing ISIS and Al-Qaeda activity. And as you can see, in 2006, at the height of Al-Qaeda in Iraq / ISI's power, its strongholds were relatively aligned with the current acquisitions by ISIS. Again, we see Al-Anbar province, Diyala, the northern regions near Mosul, essentially the peripheral regions which were left out of the new constitutional bargain established in 2005. And again, if we can compare ISIS and Al-Qaeda activity with the Al-Qaeda in Iraq propaganda map of 2006, we'll see that they largely succeeded in their efforts. Here we have two interesting maps from the Baghdad Mapping the Violence project, which unfortunately ended in 2007. It traced the origins of violence and the ethnic boundaries within the city of Baghdad from 2003 until 2007. So we see here not only in the previous maps the division of the various provinces along sectoral lines, but we also see within cities, within Baghdad, the division of the city along ethnic and sectarian lines. Here we have, in 2003, a vast majority of mixed Sunni and Shiite neighborhoods. Whereas in 2007, we see, as a result of ethnic cleansing by various militias on the ground, sectarianism has taken hold. The mixed neighborhoods were only situated in the center, where, of course, the green zone was situated. And the city itself was divided very similarly to the country. The west was dominated by the Sunnis and the east by the Shiites. Now, what are some factors that can explain the rising geopolitical prominence of ISI between 2007 and 2012? We have a bit of an idea now about the conditions that led to the rise of ISI. But how did it manage to become such a powerful force in the region despite the successes of the US surge? Well, there are various theories on the territoriality of conflict, which can contextualize political mobilization as well as the tactics and strategies of belligerents, and offer a window into what I like to call path dependencies in civil war. Perhaps the best theory that I've encountered so far is by Philippe Lebilon, who distinguishes between distant and proximate resources, as well as point and diffuse resources, and draws a broad correlation between the absence or presence of these resources on the ground and how civil wars tend to play out between different insurgency groups. Distant resources are those which are located in remote territories along porous borders and within the territory of politically marginalized groups. Distant resources are more susceptible to be seized by insurgent groups. And as a result, insurgencies tend to expand along international borders, establishing strongholds as they move along transport routes. Point resources, on the other hand, such as oil and natural gas, are usually heavily guarded by state security, and insurgents are more likely to attempt to seize these resources by directly targeting the capital through a coup d'etat. Lebilon, in his research, his 2001 paper, has drawn a very extensive correlation between numerous conflicts and instances of civil war in various countries around the world, and whether or not resources on the ground were diffuse, proximate, distant, or point resources. And as we can tell, based on this chart, oil and distant and point resources lead to secession. And insurgency groups are more likely to attempt to secede various parts of the country and to split up the country so that they can gain control of oil and natural resources in these peripheral parts of the country. Whereas point and proximate resources are more likely to lead to coup d'etat or an attempt to control the state. Oil and natural gas in Iraq, I will make the case in my research was both a case of distant and point resource in the peripheral Salahuddin and Diyala provinces, and a case of proximate and point resource close to the seat of power in Fallujah, in Ramadi, and in eastern Al-Anbar near western Baghdad. So what can we extrapolate before going further from Leblan's theory? Well, we can assume that al-Qaeda in Iraq's strategy on the ground would have been two-part. On the one hand, they would have attempted a strategy of secession in Salahuddin and Diyala, and they would have attempted a strategy of coup d'etat in Baghdad. And that's precisely what happened. Unsurprisingly, al-Qaeda in Iraq found its roots in the oil-rich and politically marginalized western part of the province of Al-Anbar, near Ramadi and Fallujah, while ISI expanded into the northern and eastern peripheral territories in order to gain these natural resources. After establishing Ramadi as the de facto capital of ISI, documents recovered from al-Zarqawi, the head of al-Qaeda in Iraq, reveal a detailed plan to use Al-Anbar as a wealthy platform to expand its operations to the disparate regions in the north and east. The plan, of course, was to enclose Baghdad, which was the seat of state and also Shiite power, and the trajectory of violence on the ground largely followed this plan. The Americans were fortunate enough to find a 41-point PowerPoint, which explained the plan step by step, and which was presented by al-Zarqawi in 2006 to militants. Following Leblan's theory, militants began encircling Baghdad through the piecemeal takeover regions, moving from Al-Anbar into Karma, Abu Ghraib in the east, and from where they shifted into the northern southeastern belts surrounding Baghdad. So those, of course, were the regions in the previous map, the outskirts of Baghdad, which began to fall to Sunni insurgents around 2006. Here we have again the map presented by General Petraeus in 2008. And as we can see that after the surge between 2007 and 2008, ISI was swept up from Al-Anbar province. It was no longer extant. But it nevertheless remained a presence in the peripheral oil-rich territories in the north and eastern parts of the country. Leblanc also talks about the war economy of looting. In the absence of an official political source of support, the best option for armed factions is often to finance violence by looting natural resources. And even with external support by wealthy donors, the profitability of looting may further establish the activity as a preferred source of income. This is what we saw again on the ground. Between 2003 and 2006, al-Qaeda in Iraq's funding largely came from wealthy Gulf states. However, after 2006 and the takeover of the Baji oil refinery in Salahuddin province, intelligence reports from the time note that ISI became a self-financing organization. A Defense Intelligence Agency report further explained that external support is not critical to the operations of insurgent groups, as criminal activity can support insurgent operating expenses many times over. And this was reported towards the end of 2006 and the beginning of 2007. Here we have a fascinating map. This was an ISI propaganda map, and this was the next step to be planned out by militias after the success of al-Zarqawi's 41-point takeover Iraq. As we can see, it shows an envisioned caliphate that moves beyond Iraq's borders and moves well into the Sunni majority territories in Syria. This was envisioned in 2006. Now, we also see in this map oil rigs. We see carefully planned oil rigs which do largely correlate with where we do know large oil and natural gas resources are situated on the ground. And the presence of these oil rigs in the propaganda map of ISI in 2006 just goes to show the centrality of the war economy of looting and how it did shape their tactical operations on the ground. Now, beyond the environment, what are some economic factors that allowed ISI to grow between 2007 and 2012? To this, I turn to Douglas North and Barry Weingast in their fantastic work, Violence and Social Orders. In this work, they establish largely the school of new institutional economics and distinguish between limited and open access economies. So moving beyond a purely microeconomic analysis of countries, new institutional economics seeks to place countries in a broad hierarchy of openness, wherein limited access orders limit political and economic participation, and open access orders provide greater political and economic participation for larger parts of the population. In limited access orders, we have a centralized number of state actors, general inequality, factionalism, clientelism, and high borders to access. And Weingast and North, by tracing the history of the Western world and of Europe in his work, draw a correlation between the type of order and the type and prevalence of violence within that order. And with limited access orders, we see that legitimacy of the state is challenged by non-state actors. And as a result, this does often lead to violence and civil conflict. We can now apply North's theory to events on the ground, as we have with the other theories, and see that once again, the theories largely do explain what happened. Between 2003 and 2006, Iraqi federalism had a divisive effect and institutionalized these cleavages between various sects. But between 2007 and 2012, an increasingly centralized and secretive state played to the worst fears of Iraqi civilians and to the best of ISI's propaganda. As in North et al.'s model, organizational appointments for offices became varied and were varied and then transferred into sectarian-based appointments. Offices as different from police chiefs to counterterrorism directors to finance ministers were chosen on the basis of their sectoral affiliation. Some state services withdrew altogether, and those that did not form part of al-Maliki's inner circle were simply ignored. The Interior Ministry pulled back the national police from Sunni territories precisely when they were needed the most. We have, of course, the famous case of Ramadi, where the ministry had left only 9 very ill-equipped and poorly situated police stations on the outskirts of the town. The Iraqi National Intelligence Service, which was established by the Americans and in part by the CIA, was overlooked by the Prime Minister, simply disregarded because he distrusted its Sunni officials. And at the height of the US surge campaign, al-Maliki barricaded himself within a small circle of Dawa party insiders, while Shiite militias had overrun the capital. Meanwhile, of course, patron-client networks were wide and dispersed and established, preventing the federal government from extracting wealth from oil and natural gas. Essentially, various warlords and chieftains on the ground took the process of extraction into their own hands. The successes of the Anbar Awakening and the US-led surge campaign do, as we've illustrated, lead to the disappearance of al-Qaeda in Iraq in western Al-Anbar province. But shortly after the Anbar Awakening, the state continues down the path of an increasingly limited access order. We see that after the 2010 election, al-Maliki refused to leave office when the al-Iraqi party was usurped by the Dawa party. And he refused to leave office because he claimed that the 2005 Constitution, Article 76, was ambiguous about whether the largest coalition or the largest party was to form the government. And in fact, he was right. Throughout 2011, civil society movements began protesting the government's inability to provide basic civil society and state services. And the Prime Minister, of course, responded, this was during the height of the Arab Spring, by violently suppressing these protest movements. What can we draw from this? Perhaps we can draw from this a full picture of the Iraqi government becoming increasingly paranoid and increasingly centralized between 2007 and 2012, leading to the destabilization of state services in the peripheral regions of the country and damaging state legitimacy. Now, by the time US forces had reclaimed Al-Anbar province as a liberated territory, ISI had simply shifted its position to the resource-rich northern and eastern peripheral territories, filling the legitimacy gap left behind by the state. With the ISF assuming full control of security in December 2011, 6 months afterwards, a new wave of sectarian violence hit Iraq in the northern regions of the country. The militants had simply been hiding from American might and re-emerged once American troops left. Now, I'll conclude my presentation with one final map, perhaps the most interesting map, detailing ISIS strongholds from 2014. And it details ISIS strongholds, but it also points out the presence of oil and natural gas on the ground. We see heavy ISIS fighting with the Kurds in the resource-rich north of the province, near Mosul, and in Salahuddin province, near western Tikrit. Now, you can also see that this map distinguishes between ISIS strongholds and recently seized cities. The path of capture followed by ISIS is the same path of capture followed by al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Anbar was very safely the heart of ISIS, Ramadi and Fallujah, whereas Nineveh, Salahuddin, the northeastern parts of the country became recent acquisitions as insurgents moved into these regions to once again reassert their control over natural resources and to fuel the war economy. Thank you very much. I hope these theories have presented a new outlook on the rise of ISIS, and now look forward to some questions. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, you spoke earlier about, you mentioned about the term legitimacy.
Sure.
I was wondering, what do you mean by legitimacy? Who grants legitimacy?
So in the theory outlined by Douglas North and Barry Von Gast, legitimacy is popularly defined within the national context. So whereas I agree that there are different definitions, there's international legitimacy, of course. Douglas North in his book traces violence and rising civil strife to the lack of popular legitimacy.
Popular legitimacy, you mean people thinking that their government can provide services?
Cannot provide services,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And as we saw in Iraq, they often could not provide services.
I just have so you identify like a few different theories, right?
Sure.
Which could be applicable. I'm a little bit confused as to what like evidential criteria you would have to pick one theory against another, because it
Sure.
seems like essentially you're trying to verify the theories, right? So the data verifies them, but the data could verify sort of all of them, essentially,
Sure.
and they could also verify a whole load more. So,
Sure.
you know, how would you start to pick one theory over another? Just
Sure.
to put it really reductively.
Sure, yeah. So my criteria for choosing the theories was based on whether they were established and largely universally accepted. So for the political theories of post-transitional violence, those are largely accepted, and I want to test whether or not they do apply to this situation.
Mm-hmm.
The same goes for the environmental and economic-based theories. Again, I wanted to test these established theories. Now, for the legal institutional theory, that was a theory that I came up with on my own, the comparison. But again, it was an approach that was conducted in Lebanon. And so I wanted to see if it worked out here as well.
Okay.
Slightly counterfactual
Sure.
question with regards to legitimacy. Do you think that had the al-Maliki government been more representative among the different sectarian groups in Iraq, that would have in any way headed off the rise of IS without giving it enough robustness to prevent? Or would you think there's a sense of inevitability in the rise of IS that transcends?
I don't think that there is inevitability. I think there's a very interesting anecdote that explains largely my opinion on this. In 2007 and 2008, the al-Maliki government was finally convinced by the Americans to put local Sunni Anbar awakening, and therefore Sunnis allied with the Americans, on the payroll of the Iraqi security forces. And this was many years after the insurgency had already began. And once they had decided to put these local forces on the payroll, we saw the Anbar awakening. We saw volunteers showing up in Sunni Al-Anbar province to fight and push back al-Qaeda in Iraq. And as we saw in the map presented by General Petraeus, the surge worked. And so I think if the government had then not again rescinded into factionalism and to a secretive form of sectarianism, we wouldn't have seen the resurgence of al-Qaeda under the new guise of ISIS.
How dominant were Sunni Iraqis in the Hussein regime?
They were fairly prominent, and that is precisely why the CPA instituted. The CPA instituted a de-Baathification policy without recognizing that the majority of Baathists were Sunni Arabs.
This might just reflect my lack of knowledge about the subject, but I'm quite surprised at how much of a distinction you've drawn between Syria and Iraq and ISIS's role in each just being sort of very distinct. I was
Sure.
wondering if you could just elaborate a bit
Sure.
on that, just because I'm not particularly familiar with that.
Sure. So the rise of ISIS in Syria can be largely traced to the release of militias and prisoners by Assad. And so Syria is a different beast altogether. In Syria, we had the Arab Spring, we had the Syrian civil war, and we saw somewhere between 2012 and 2014, in an effort to delegitimize the Free Syrian Army and to delegitimize coalition efforts against the Assad regime, the mass release of prisoners, prisoners who were previously forced into captivity as a result of being allied with al-Qaeda in Iraq. In Iraq, on the other hand, ISIS was, as we saw, a homegrown movement. This was a result of al-Qaeda in Iraq playing up propaganda, playing on the worst fears of citizens, and militias simply hiding, waiting for the Americans to leave.
Okay. It's very different. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Rabbi.
My understanding is you put three groups in Iraq as three monolithic groups: Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds. But my understanding is the Shias are numerous, and the Sunnis are numerous within themselves. So is it accurate to draft the map of Iraq as three sections, or is it much more complex?
It's much more complex. In fact, there's many more disparate ethnic minorities and political minorities. So in the National Assembly that was formed and in the governing council, the three major sects were the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites. But then, as I also mentioned, we had communists. We had Christian minorities. We had Druze. So there are different other players on the ground. But the Kurds are a key player nevertheless. They comprised approximately 20% of the population.
What I mean to say, within the Sunnis themselves, and within the Shias themselves,
Sure.
are they infinitely fragmented?
So
Complicating
yes, yeah, and that's a very sharp point. This is best perhaps illustrated by the Anbar Awakening. So there were many towns like Ramadi and Fallujah which profited from the presence of al-Qaeda in Iraq, because the local political leaders, the sheikhs, were allied both politically and also ideologically with al-Qaeda's mission. But the fact that al-Anbar was then swept clear of militants means that there were very, very large portions of the population which did not like the presence of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And in fact, the way that the Americans won over various local tribal leaders in al-Anbar province was by pointing out the fact that there was no rule of law under al-Qaeda in Iraq either. It was just simply rule of violence. It wasn't an established rule of law. And so they essentially gave them hope. They told them, if you hold out and side with us, we will impose rule of law.
Kind of going off his question.
Sure.
Al-Baghdadi is, the head of ISIS overarchingly, right? Like Syria and Iraq. To me, it would make sense to, if we're trying to come up with a theory of ISIS,
Sure.
to look at ISIS all-encompassingly.
Sure.
To not so much make a theory looking specifically at within a country's borders and such. I mean, so do you disagree with that? Like, I mean, yeah,
Sure,
I guess.
sure. So I don't disagree. I think that's the next step. And so at the moment, my research is focusing on Iraq and the birth of ISIS as a phenomenon. But I do definitely think Syria plays an important part, and definitely understudied as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My question slightly related to that. What's actually the map?
Mm.
Sure, I think it was from one of these slides from the Al-Zawi presentation where it showed that an emerging Islamic state in Iraq, but also that spread into the Sunni parts of Syria. And this was 2006. I'm just curious if at that point they had some kind of plan as to how they were going to extend into Syria before the Assad government was destabilized before the civil war.
Yeah, so Al-Qaeda did have an affiliate in Syria, and in fact, between 2003 and 2006, the vast majority of insurgents, and then before 2003 as well, the vast majority of Al-Qaeda insurgents in Iraq were trained in Syria. And so the border was very porous. In fact, many Syrians fighting on the ground and taking control of provinces in the western regions of Iraq. Many fighters were Syrian. So yes, the plan was to use Al-Qaeda in Syria and to spread out, but there was no one had accounted for the al-Assad government, and the Assad government, their philosophy in a sense was the enemy of my enemy, right? If we have no other questions, thank you very much for listening to the talk. I hope you enjoyed it.
Cool. Thanks so much.